Alright, this is going to be entry number 6. Habit and habitat. So in my last video that I made, I basically talked about the concept of I versus I, the capitalized I versus the lowercase I. So I'm going to talk about the concept of habit versus habitat. So in the animal kingdom, genes and things are unlocked based on an animalistic pattern to its environment and the previous genes that was passed down from it from its ancestors. So, because of human beings, we're not inside of the animal world to a degree, or at least the way that we perceive things is outside of the animal world. We create our environments rather than necessarily being truthfully born into them. We are, but that's only partial of who we are rather than the absolute whole. So, basically, as you're growing up, you have a core sense of self and things that you're interested in, things that you want to do. You have things inside of you that you're willing to express. But society and the world around you necessarily, they will not agree with those things. So what would happen is they would begin to impose their own structure, which would, in a sense, thin out the animalistic impulses you have as a kid. What cause you to be more patient, to be more observant, it cause you to think before you speak, all the things that our parents basically taught us. But sometimes that structure of our family becomes so intense and so overbearing that they start to look at the core of who we are and throw that away. So when that happens, everything is born with a specific virtue. So when that happens, your virtue kind of goes out of the window, or that intrinsic thing that is unique to you that you can use to benefit yourself, the world, and everything around you if you figure out how to apply it. We throw that out and then we adopt the personality of what our parents or what society or what anybody else would necessarily want us to be. So when we adopt those things, it causes a split in our consciousness. When it causes a split in our consciousness, we're in a sense housing two different people at one time. So that is the big I and little I that I was talking about. But this housing of two different people and everything, the way that this kind of conflicts is that you start to become the concept of disembodied, meaning you start to only gain access of parts of yourself surrounding certain individuals or certain environments in which you have a free emotional fulfillment to actually be yourself. A lot of times you see this with a lot of good kids that you hear nothing wrong with them, and then out of nowhere they're locked up for certain things, or they're pregnant or something like this. It comes from the whole concept of disembodiment. So growing up, your parents are supposed to guide you and help you through everything. What I mean by that is, concepts of sex and all of those things. They're supposed to be the ones to teach you about this stuff. Concepts of how the way to get around in the world and how the way to necessarily maneuver in the world. They're supposed to teach you these things. The reason why is because you never asked to be here. You were born off of the offshoot of them having a pleasurable effect. So the least they can do is necessarily prepare you for how to be governed and how to live inside of the world. So when your parents are worried about some of the wrong things and everything like that, or if your parents are toxic, or if your parents are very, very abusive, what happens is who you are when you're inside the house or when you're around this type of structure, you start to repress all of those emotions. So as you're constantly going around adapting to everything and everyone, you start to lose bits and parts of yourself. When you lose bits and parts of yourself, metaphysically what kind of happens is that you start to regress somewhat, and you start to necessarily pick up something to give you some sense of, I would say, clarity or sanity. So because you're consistently abiding by what other people believe and your own personal identity of who you are has been destroyed, everything that you do that is against your will, that you're forcing yourself to necessarily do, a part of you necessarily dies, or a part of you represses or charges. So now what happens is personality is now degrading, meaning you're going from a civilized person to an uncivilized person, meaning that just because a person has not shown all of those things and they just snap, it doesn't mean that that meter has not been building. So when those things happen and everything like that, you feel so much pain because you're forcing yourself to do things that are not suited for you. You know, they're not for you, they're for other people necessarily. You know, it's just your parents telling you to do all of the things based on fear-based thoughts that they had based on their time when it's a completely different time. And then if you cannot succeed or do things in the same manner in which they have, even though times have changed and things get harder, you're then punished and blamed for all of those things. And then you're basically called useless when essentially they need your help with literally almost every form of new technology that we have. So you have all of these conflicting emotions that you can't necessarily act on, so you repress them. When you start to repress them, the repression of those emotions start to hurt, so then you seek something to necessarily take the edge off. So because your habitat is screwed up, you now develop a habit. So when you develop a habit, it's more so like the true version of you is inside of yourself that only comes out once you have the calmed effect of whatever thing that you have been habitually using necessarily. When in reality, that true version of yourself is supposed to come out in whatever habitat it is. And if you can, you're supposed to change that habitat. Or you're supposed to necessarily better what happens with what your parents necessarily don't. So when that habit necessarily comes, it becomes a whole list of repression. When that repression happens and everything like that, you start to lose senses of who you are, and you start to look for immediate validation and gratification 24/7. So gratification and validation are not the same towards everybody. So for example, when you see people going around looking for fights and beating people's ass and shit like that for just the sake of fighting, they get gratification and validation that they're worthy to be here because they can withstand and they can conquer others and no one can conquer them. That is also that's an animalistic impulse. So that's also beast mentality being played out in humanity. So what happens with this repression and everything, this repression builds up over time until it starts to develop another personality per se. So all of the things that you go through and everything, and all of the things that give you negative feelings when you're not trying to embrace those things, or when you can't embrace them, they start to charge up a meter and you start to change your behavior to necessarily avoid them. When you start changing your behavior to avoid them, that's not necessarily you. That is the you that's trying to survive based on the uncomfortable feeling of what someone else is introducing towards you. So as you're necessarily trying to avoid all of these things, you start to develop all kinds of different types of things that you see other people do that they find comfort in. So to figure out a sense of community or to find out another habitat, you start to partake in said things. You start doing drugs, you start necessarily sleeping around, you start lacking on all of your goals, ideals, ambitions, and actually thoughts. You stop trying to process all of your emotions. You stop trying to necessarily figure out how to move in the world, and you stop trying to find out the root purpose of what is the whole reason why we're necessarily here. And then when that happens, basically we're stuck in the cycle of samsara again. So a cycle of just repetition, repeating, and trying to get a sense of bliss rather than figuring out what the whole problem is and solving that. So when we become these fractured individuals that have lost their virtue, or they lost their sense of identity, we seek to basically join groups of others that we feel comfort in too. When we necessarily do that, we start creating different personalities and different versions of ourselves. And then all of these different alters necessarily all have their own identifying reason of being. So if somebody wants basically affection and love and they haven't gotten it from their parents, a lot of the times they will have a lot of friends. Although they will have a lot of friends around them, they would try to bond with people, they would idolize people, they would worship people. A lot of the times they would basically use their body for gratification. And all of these things is just to fill the emptiness within them that is their own self that they refuse to look at, because all of their life they have been taught that this thing is necessarily wrong and you have to fix it, when in reality it's not fixing anything, but everything has its proper place from which it needs to be put into. And I think the biggest problem with the world is that everybody has lost their sense of virtue. So we go to all of these different groups, all of these different people, and all of these different things, and then we fully embody what they stand for rather than what each individual stands for, period. Because at the end of the day, we all scared of being alone. But alone is where you find your most power. So that was just my little expert for habit versus habitat. That was entry 6. I'm coming to entry 7 in a minute. All right, y'all have a good one.